Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the first lecture of the History of Christianity 1 course. In this section, we'll look at the benefits we can expect from studying this material. And of course, that raises and addresses the question of why study history. Some people may object that it's just dead stories about dead people that we'll never meet, who lived in faraway places where we'll never go, dealing with unconnected situations we'll never experience. History might seem totally irrelevant for the lives we live today, but I believe it's not, and I'm going to try and explain why. Let me start by mentioning that my younger brother is a college football coach, and one of the things he does is watch game film to scout the opponent. By looking at what the opposing team has done in previous games, he can learn patterns and tendencies that will help him to predict what the team will do, which will help him prepare what his own team will do to beat them. By learning the past, he has a great advantage in preparing for the present and future. And that doesn't just work for sports, it works for life as well. There's a reason we study history, to give us an advantage for life. It's amazing that more people don't pick up on this secret. Instead of learning the hard way from our own mistakes, we can learn from other people's mistakes. Same lesson learned, none of the pain. And instead of learning everything from scratch ourselves, we can learn from other people's successes. Same lesson, fraction of the time and effort. And again, it's amazing that more people don't pick up on this secret. Cicero once wrote, "He who is ignorant of the past remains as a child." And Edmund Burke said, "Those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it." So let's examine in detail the purpose for studying history. What specific things can we accomplish? What are the results of knowing history? Why should we do it? The first reason I would suggest is in order to know God. The Bible is history. The revelation of God by which we know Him is in the form of a large story of what He has done with and for His people in the real world in the past. And the book of Acts purposely ends in a way to show that the big story has not yet come to its intended conclusion, because God is still working in the world. This later history is not God's word of revelation like the Bible is, but we can still learn to know God better from learning what He's done throughout history. Just like you can get to know people by observing what they do, we can know God by what He does, especially by what He has already done. History is, in some sense, His working. His handiwork reveals things about Himself, and we can learn His ways by paying attention to it, because all of history is His story. If we believe that history is just chance, if we're just apes with a shave living in a world with no purpose, then history is bunk. But Christians confess that God rules history. History has meaning because it is God's story. God orchestrates history according to how He wants it to end. And all history gets its ultimate meaning from the judgment and eternal destiny to which it is all heading. And all of history is the battleground between two kingdoms, and God wins. So, all of history is purposely building to His good purposes and somehow reveals God all along the way. And the second reason to study history is in order to know people. History is a laboratory. It gives us millions of case studies of people and how they behave in certain situations. We can learn a lot about human nature from history. People are wonderful, and yet they're fallible. People can be loved and celebrated, and yet never fully trusted. We behave like beings created in the image of God, doing so much good and right, and we also behave like beings ruined by sin, doing so much wrong and harmful. And those in Christ also behave like those whose lives have been changed and who are being used to bear witness to the gospel and God's kingdom. And we study history in order to know ourselves and our heritage. If you were descended from royalty or from some hero or important person, it would probably change the way that you thought about yourself and even the way that you behaved. We are all a product of where we have come from to some extent. As the textbook says, each generation stands on the shoulders of its predecessors, like acrobats in a vast human pyramid. Thus, to tell the story of those whose heirs we are is to write a long preface to our own life stories. And it says, without understanding the past, we are unable to understand ourselves. For in a sense, the past still lives in us and influences who we are and how we understand the Christian message. And our knowledge of our past shapes who we are and what we do. Stephen Mansfield wrote, consider the little-known story of Stephen, an Italian sailor. In the 1400s, Stephen and a fellow sailor were walking an Algerian beach shortly before setting sail for their return to Italy. As they strolled the beach, they happened upon the battered body of a missionary to the Muslims who had been beaten and left for dead. Since they knew the missionary, they took him on board their ship and set sail. Though a storm soon blew them off course, they ended up near the coast of Majorca, which happened to be the missionary's birthplace. Aware that he was dying, the missionary asked to see the coast of Majorca once again. When he was brought on deck, though, he pointed not at his homeland, but at the western horizon and said, beyond the sea that washes this continent we know, there lies another continent which we have never seen, whose natives are wholly ignorant of the gospel. Send men there. And having spoken those words, he died. Stephen returned to Italy and told this story to his children and then his grandchildren. And one of Stephen's grandchildren took the story deeply to heart and sought God earnestly about the missionary's words. Soon this grandson recognized that Jesus had called him to take the light of the gospel to heathen of undiscovered lands. And his grandson's name was Christopher Columbus. The stories we believe about where we come from shape who we are. That's why many bad people these days are trying to rewrite history in order to divide and discourage people. They're trying to steal people's real identities with a deceitful indoctrination into whatever history they want people to believe in order to make them into the kind of people they want them to be. Totalitarian countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Cuba all had their histories rewritten to erase any connection the people had with their past. Karl Marx himself wrote, take away the heritage of a people and they are easily conquered. And so good history can protect us and our identity. Because good, true, honest history can protect our God-given heritage and identity, so that we can be transformed into our God-given destiny and not some destiny imposed on us by evil people. So learn good history well, or you will open yourself up to be oppressed by bad and deceptive history. And we study history in order to know beyond ourselves and our own limited experience. The world and God's works go beyond our time and place, and we're impoverished if we don't take advantage of learning things secondhand. The world did not begin when I was born. It does not revolve around me, and the same is true about you. And so we must all find meaning in something bigger than ourselves. We're kind of like a fish that doesn't see the water because it lives in it. We might laugh at the stupidity and naivety of some of the beliefs and practices of people of another age, because we now see from a perspective free from their blind spots. But if we're thoughtful, we immediately wonder how many of our practices and beliefs are just as stupid and naive. But we can't see it because of the assumptions of our situation and culture. Now, studying history gives us humility and wonder, and a bit of ability to step outside of our own time and place, so that we can see the blind spots of our own time and place. And we get a sense of perspective by looking at giants and by standing on their shoulders. The Puritans shame us with the shallowness and frivolity of our devotion and commitment compared to theirs. And we think we're smart until we meet Jonathan Edwards or Augustine. We think we can preach until we meet John Chrysostom. We think we have faith until we meet Hudson Taylor. We think we have commitment until we meet the anchorites. We think we're brave until we see Athanasius standing against the entire world and winning. See, history gives us wider perspective with which to see and measure our own age. As C.S. Lewis wrote in On the Reading of Old Books, the only protection is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there's any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we're already committing, and their own errors will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. And we study history to help us know the present better. For instance, the current church, its present divisions, denominations, practices, strengths, problems, and opportunities can almost all be explained by understanding its history, how it got here. And no matter what you hear, the USA was decisively influenced, for better and worse, by Christian people and ideas. And most of our current problems stem from a conscious rejection and moving away from Christian ideas and influence. We understand the mess our society is in partly by understanding how it got here. And that helps us to see how God will hopefully get us out. And that means that studying history helps us to know the future. You see, God never changes. Certain things will always eventually receive his blessing, and certain other things will always eventually receive his discipline. And human nature stays the same. And nature itself has built-in consequences. If we're wise, if we know history, and if we pay attention, we can tell which way the historical wind is blowing. And that helps us to discern our own calling, the part that we should play. Now, imagine you're an actor or actress thrown on stage and forced to improvise in Act 15 of a play that's been going on. Well, you could act so much better if you're already familiar with what had happened in Acts 1 through 14. See, we learn from history that God works in the messy world of real life, and therefore, we need to get busy living out our Christianity, not just in the ideal world of academics, spirituality, and devotion, not in a cloister separated from the world, but we need to live out our Christian faith in this messy world 24/7. At school, in our prayer closets, but also out in the workplace and in the marketplace. And history reminds us that Christianity is not just doctrine, but whole life. Now, I mentioned before, but I want to emphasize again, that history helps us to learn by example. Job 8 through 10 says, "Ask the former generations and find out what their fathers learned. For we were born only yesterday and know nothing, and our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not instruct you and tell you? Will they not bring forth words from their understanding?" Now, in history, we see repetitions of the same issues and controversies. The names and places change, but some of the underlying dynamics remain the same. And you might find a great help in dealing with your own situation by seeing how people have dealt with very similar situations in the past. Now, one example, people are now talking a lot about how the church should relate to the culture. And that's a fairly important issue today. But it's also an issue which the church has been struggling with for centuries. God commands us to learn from examples of those before us. Isaiah 51, 1 and 2 says, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah, who gave you birth. When I called him, he was but one, and I blessed him and made him many." You see, we can have thousands of helpful mentors from history. And there are many good examples, heroes and faithful people, good and wise actions to imitate. And there are many bad examples, villains and fools, bad and stupid actions to avoid. and we learn the lessons from their consequences. And we can also learn the concept that some actions that seemed wise at the time had unintended consequences and weren't wise in the long run because they didn't think it through well enough. Hebrews 12:1 says, "We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses." Those people and stories of the past bearing witness to us in order to encourage us and call us to righteous action. And we study history to learn how things really work. We can start to see the complex nature of life in historical investigation. We can start to see also how things are connected. Causes have effects, but the causes are often multiple and complex in their interaction. There might be political factors and social factors and economic factors and personal factors. That is, people have different personalities, gifts, and abilities. And doctrine is usually a key factor. The theology, worldview, and ideas which people have, they always have consequences. And all these things together make up what happened and what is happening and what will happen. These actions and effects then are the partial causes of more effects. And if we're wise, we will learn from history to understand the times. To be like the men of Issachar, who understood the times and knew what to do. We can try to process through and learn some principles about how things influence one another, how people and societies change for better and for worse. And finally, we study history to learn that God really is faithful and sovereign. Jesus promised that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. And history has proven that hell has not prevailed, and it will not. Tyrants throughout the ages have tried to stop Christ and his church. The tyrants all die, but the church lives on. And this gives us not just humility, but hope, gratitude, and trust. We learn that we can't keep track of all the causes and consequences because the world is too big and complicated for any of us to completely understand. And so we're forced to look to God's guidance. There is way too much history for us to learn, let alone understand and apply. Now, we need to do our best, and that's why we're studying history. But we can trust that even when we don't fully understand, and when there are things beyond our control, God still knows what he's doing. So in summary, we study history to more effectively live history and make history. Booker T. Washington said, "The future is always built out of the materials of the past." We learn theology and we learn history, and that together gives us clarity so that we can see the urgency of our situation. Our culture is extremely similar to the cultural corruption of Rome, which led to its fall as a society. And we see the opportunity of our situation. Our culture is also extremely similar to 18th century England, which was corrupt and looked like it would fall right before God brought great revival. And he can do it again. And this helps us to make a godly strategy. God can do it again, and we should pray that he would and work toward it. History does not need to be boring. Many of these stories have been turned into movies. History can be engaging and dramatic, often reads like a novel. And yet, at the same time, history's not Hollywood. It's engaging and dramatic, but sometimes over long, sometimes boring and painful stretches of time. God's people are called to faithfulness over the long haul in every situation. And the loose ends are not always neatly wrapped up in a 2-hour movie, or even in one lifetime. History is messy because life is messy. But God always wins, and his people share in that victory. So now, let's review. We study history to know God, to know people, to know ourselves and our heritage, to know beyond ourselves, to know the present, to know the future, to know our calling, to learn from the experience of others, to learn how life works, and to learn that God is faithful and sovereign. And that brings us to some questions that I'm asking you to think about and discuss in order to take this to heart and apply it in your own life. First, which of these goals of studying history most resonated with you, and why? What stood out as more important for your own life situation? What do you hope to receive and achieve by studying history? And next, what issues do you see that the current church is wrestling with now? Do you think these or similar issues have happened before in history? What kind of things would you hope to learn from history that will help you better navigate our current issues? How can we use history to make us wiser in our current situations and challenges? And finally, I'll ask the same question in a slightly different way. As you observe your surrounding culture and the church's current challenges, how will knowing history help you understand and address this better? Based on what you already know about history, what problems have been dealt with before? How has ignorance of the past contributed to the problems that we're seeing again? And how can knowing history help us to do better this time? Now, at this point in every section, I'm going to pause for a few seconds, but I'm suggesting that you pause the video for as long as you need in order to think about and discuss these questions and apply them in your own life. Now, if you're taking this course for credit, this is the time to complete the first part of your discussion assignment. If you're working through this with a group, this is the time for discussion in whatever manner the group leader leads. Or if you're working through this on your own, take the time to process these things before you move on. Now, after the break, I'll come back and give some guiding principles that I hope will help you process through these things. But I think it's important for you to work through these applications on your own before I give my input. And then after I give some guiding principles, you can go back and discuss based on any new insight. But first, work through the application on your own or in your group. And so I'll pause for that now, and you should pause the video. Okay, now let me share some guiding principles from this section. These are my simple suggestions for applications. And in this first section, they're fairly basic. First, God has given us a great gift in history. It is a cheat sheet that we can use to become wise far beyond our own individual experience, so that we can learn and know all the things that we saw in this section. And therefore, I suggest that you pay attention to all these things as you study history. Learn lessons from history. Take advantage of this gift that you've been given. And I suggest that you pursue all of these goals that we listed as you study history throughout the rest of this course. Use these lessons to become wise and more successfully navigate your own slice of history, and even to change history for the better by God's grace. All right, that's all for this section. I hope you're more excited now about the possibilities of studying history, and you're motivated to really learn and apply the material in this course. In the next section, we'll look at how we can study history well to get the most out of it. And I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.